what is Zen? That's a good question. It's hard to answer with words, but I think it's a method of practice where you're trying to be aware of the current moment that we're living in. And so my wife and I meditate every morning. We do other practices associated with traditional Zen practice. My wife and I usually meditate together every morning. So we were really lucky. We bought a house in Missoula that actually had a Zendo, a little Zen practice center inside it. And so we live right near Mount Sentinel, and so we meditate looking up at Mount Sentinel pretty much every morning, except when we're traveling like we are now. That very nice introduction. A little bit about one of the founders of the field of conservation genetics. I think that's just a gag that my grad students came up with, so they can call me the grandfather of conservation genetics. But conservation genetics, so I got my Ph.D. at the University of Washington in the early 1970s, and I was interested in applying genetics to problems in conservation. So I was one of the first people that was trying to do this. The first techniques came along that we could actually study genetic variation in natural populations, and so we were trying to develop ways that we could use this genetic information to help conserve noisy birds and other species. So I'm really happy to be here tonight and to see so many people here. I had no idea whether there's going to be my wife and I and a few other people or a big audience, so this is really great. And I'd like to thank the Fisheries Biology Department at Humboldt. They invited me down here, so I'm giving a talk. If you want to hear about genetics, I'm giving a talk tomorrow at 5 o'clock somewhere.
Science B 133.
But tonight is different, so, well, let's go. So this is the book, so that I wrote this a few years ago with Sally Aiken and Gordon Lukart. So my primary research focus, my first love is scientifically is genetics. And so my passion is really applying the principles of genetics to problems in conservation. And I'm happy to talk about people tonight if they want to, or they can come to my talk tomorrow. But I've been warned that these seats get sore after about an hour, so I'm going to try to keep this short. I've been a Zen practitioner since the early 1990s, and as well as writing a lot about genetics and conservation, I've written a few things about trying to put together science and spirituality. So the top one was published in Conservation Biology, and I also taught a course, Environmental Studies, at the University of Montana called Ecology, Buddhism and Ecology, which is kind of ironic because I really don't know much about either one of them. But it was sure a fun course for me to teach every year, and I think the students got a lot out of it. And I was ordained in the Thich Nhat Hanh's Order of Interbeing in 1994, so that's sort of my training in Zen and Buddhism. So I've been practicing Zen for about 25 years. I was a member of Thich Nhat Hanh's Order of Interbeing. I'm really happy. I just had this paper, which is just published in the journal Evolutionary Applications. So this is really nice, publishing a paper on Zen and deep evolution in a biological journal. And this is similar to what I'm going to be talking about tonight, but it's slightly different. So the three main points in this paper, so if you're interested, you can look in Evolutionary Applications. It's online in early view. So my 3 points were that, from my perspective, Zen and science are both based on empirical observations of the world. Zen and science both tell us that there's no separation between humans and the world around us. Ecology and evolution provide the scientific background needed to address the biodiversity crisis, but Zen provides a deeper knowing that will motivate our action to address this problem. And so that really gives a good idea of where my perspective, of where I'm coming from. And I guess my roots in Buddhism, in a way, I was in Vietnam 51 years ago, and I remember seeing, actually I saw this Buddha statue. This is in Nha Trang, Vietnam. So this is a picture taken last year. My wife and I went back to Vietnam. But I remember as a 19-year-old kid looking up and seeing the statue on a hill. And there was something about it that just captivated me way back then. And I didn't really understand it until many years later, but I really think in some ways this is where my interest in Zen Buddhism began. So I first was interested in Buddhism. I was in Vietnam 50 years ago, and I saw Buddha statues in Vietnam, and they really had some attraction to me that I didn't really understand. But then about 25, 26 years ago, I began practicing with a local group in Missoula, Montana. So I'm a professor at the University of Montana in Missoula. So the Dalai Lama, as I think most people know, has written a lot about the relationship between science and Buddhism. And I really like this quote. I think I really believe this with my whole heart in terms of my own personal life, that spirituality and science are different but complementary ways of trying to find the same goal, and that is seeking the truth. And if anybody's interested in the relationship in a more academic way that I'm going to be talking about, David Barish from the University of Washington wrote this book a few years ago, which is a really nice summary of looking at the teachings of the Buddha and trying to combine those with basic biology, especially ecology. If somebody's interested in Zen, the only way to get started is to find a local group, some kind of a Zen meditation group, and finding a Sangha and start spending time with them. It's not something, I mean, reading a book can give you some idea of what it's all about, but in terms of Zen practice, you really have to practice with other people in a local Sangha. The Buddha, I think one of the things, I think most people understand that Buddhism is different than other religions, and I think the major difference begins because the Buddha didn't claim there was any kind of divine inspiration. So he just tried to understand the world around him using his own brain. And he also taught, one of the reasons I say that Buddhism or Zen is empirical, and that when he went to visit this town called Kalama, which is not the one on the Columbia River, but one in Nepal. And people there questioned, we have all these spiritual teachers come through, why do we know that what you're telling us is something we should pay attention to? And his answer was that you should try it out and see if it agrees with reason, common sense, and actually has the effect that I'm trying to have, and that is to lead to greater happiness and benefit of yourself. And so Buddha taught that his teachings, like anybody else's teachings, should be empirically tested. And I like to think of, a little bit of poetic license here, but I like to think that Buddha was an evolutionary ecologist. So one of the major teachings is emptiness, or things are empty of a separate self. Everything is connected. And I think that is really one of the lessons of ecology. And one of the second major teachings of the Buddha is impermanence. That everything is changing, and that's what we learn from evolution. So there's been a lot of books and people have talked about ecology and Buddhism, but I'm not an ecologist, but I am an evolutionary biologist. So what I'm going to do tonight is try to looking at Buddhism, Zen Buddhism from an evolutionary perspective. And in doing this, it's really been helpful for me trying to combine these two interests that I have. And I've learned a lot that I'm going to be talking tonight about natural selection, genetic drift, and mutation, which are three of the four primary forces or ways that allele frequencies change in natural populations. So it really is going to be a combination of evolutionary genetics and Buddhism. And I won't be talking about gene flow, but I think I will talk about those other three. And the major points of what I'd like to talk about tonight is first recognizing that we view the world around us through a lens which has really been molded by evolution and natural selection. Second is the role of chance, that serendipity plays an important role in evolution, and some Buddhist teachers, including the Dalai Lama, have had difficulty accepting the role of chance in evolution because, as I'll talk about, they think it is counter to the idea of karma or cause and effect in evolution. And finally, thinking about human nature, that human nature, both of our selfish and our altruistic behaviors, can be understood by looking at natural selection and the products of evolution. So we're going to begin, well, not begin, but in a few minutes we're going to do a little guided meditation. And one of the koans, I think most people know about koans. What's the sound of one hand clapping, for example, is a classic koan. So as an evolutionary biologist, one of my favorite koans is, what did your face look like before your parents were born? And from my perspective, this is what most of your parents looked like before you were born. And if we go back and look at deep evolution, that this is the evolutionary tree going back to 4 billion years ago, looking at all the biological diversity that we're aware of, and we're over here in that right-hand circle, the eukaryotes, animals and plants and fungi. And animals are just this little branch up there, a very small branch of all the biological diversity that there is. And if we go and look at that, the very tip of that branch, so this goes back 4 billion years, and if we just go back and look at the last 5 million years, so a very small part of it, we can see humans and the great apes, and that humans and bonobos and chimps have only been separated for somewhere about 5 million years. So we literally have shared 99.9% of our evolutionary ancestry with chimps and bonobos. And so that's sort of the intellectual view of this, looking at a tree like this. But I'd like to look at sort of the spiritual view also, making the contrast between intellectual knowledge, which is the way that we looked at DNA sequences and somebody drew that tree, versus what it really means to know or experience that tree, and looking at the contrast between science and Zen. So when we're all little kids, our mother may have told us that don't touch that pan because it's hot, but that doesn't always work. But once we experience how hot that pan is, that's a different way of knowing. And that's one way that I'm trying to make this contrast between knowing something intellectually and knowing something at a deeper or experiential level. And I came across this quote from Jane Goodall, which I really like. I think probably everybody knows Jane Goodall spent her life studying chimpanzees. And here she's describing an experience that she had sitting with the chimpanzees. I and the chimpanzees, the earth and trees and air seemed to merge to become one with the spirit power of life itself. In a flash of outsight, I had known timelessness and quiet ecstasy, sense of truth of which mainstream science is merely a small fraction. And I don't know if people, so as a geneticist, Barbara McClintock was a corn geneticist who also used sort of this kind of deeper way of knowing to even understand chromosomes in corn. I think it's easier to see trying to understand chimpanzees than corn. But I think there is another way of understanding things other than going through by the scientific method. In fact, Barbara McClintock, which I had thrown the slide in, talks about, so she won the Nobel Prize for her work with corn. She went to Cornell as a graduate student, and she couldn't be accepted. She wanted to work with corn in the agriculture department, and she couldn't because the ag school didn't take females. And so she got a degree in botany, but still worked on corn. And it was just amazing the way that her mind worked. She had a hard time explaining to her colleagues what she understood, because she understood it not by going through the scientific method, but by other ways of knowing, which only she could explain. And she, from her words, she used the scientific method only when she had to explain to other people what she really understood. So tonight, we're going to do it's going to be about 6-minute meditation, guided meditation. And so I hate it when you read a paper and they ask a question and they don't answer the question in the paper. So since the behind the colon in my title was when did your life begin? Well, I guess I am going to help you. I'm going to help you find that answer tonight. So we're going to do a guided meditation in which we're going to try to experience evolution. So if everybody can get comfortable, just put their feet on the floor flat. It's only about 5 or 6 minutes long. I know from experience that some people have difficulty meditating, but I think it's short enough. I think everybody will be able to, I hope everybody will enjoy it. So I'm going to read 4 paragraphs, and in between those, after each of the paragraphs, you should contemplate what I read in that paragraph. It's going to be about a minute, minute and a half. And then, so altogether, it'll be about 6 minutes. And the name of this guided meditation is When Did Your Life Begin? Go back to your birth, when convention says your life began. However, you existed in your mother's womb for many months before. The egg and sperm that joined to create your genome existed before they united. Your mother's egg divided to determine which genes she would pass on to you while she was a fetus inside her mother, your grandmother. Contemplate your parents and your 4 grandparents. Who were they? How did they live? Continue looking deeper. Your ancestors double each generation. 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on. Go back 1,000 years, some 40 generations. 1,000 years ago, you had 1 trillion ancestors. The genes in every cell of your body were then shared among those ancestors, spread around the globe: Europe, Asia, America, Africa. Who were they? How did they live? One billion years ago, you now have been joined in your ancestral journey by all living species that we recognize in our daily lives. You are the wolf, the bear, the whale, the salmon, and the river otter. Your ancestors are simple, single-cell organisms living in the waters of the primitive earth. Who were they? How did they live? The last step in your journey, 4 billion years ago. There are no signs of life here. The stream of ancestors that you have been following has ended in a series of complex chemical reactions in which non-living elements are becoming the simplest of possible living organisms. Contemplate the beginning of your life. So one of the things that I'm always amazed at is when we think about going back in time. So people like to do genealogies, but we don't really appreciate just how quickly the number of our ancestors increases. So as I said in the guided meditation, so 1,000 years ago, which really, as an evolutionary biologist, 1,000 years ago is very in the recent past, the number of our ancestors increases, doubles each generation. So if we assume the average generation interval in humans is 25 years, so there's 4 generations in 100 years, that's 40 generations. And there were 1 trillion ancestors. And we have to remember, well, you should appreciate that we have a huge genome, but there's only about 6 billion base pairs in that genome. And yet we had 1 trillion ancestors. So most of those ancestors, if we go back just 1,000 years ago, we don't have any genes in our genome from those ancestors. There's just a few. If we go back to a lot of people here are European, if we go back to European ancestry, there were few individuals that were highly successful and other ones were not so successful. And when I try to combine sort of my Zen and evolutionary self, so this is a slightly different time frame. So this is 2,000 years rather than 1,000. So there's a lot of room for certain genes. Since we had 1 trillion ancestors and only 6 billion base pairs, there's a lot of room for natural selection or for some genes, some portions of the genome to be more successful than others in terms of natural selection. So this was a paper using all the sequencing that we have available today from thousands of humans and trying to look what did the human genome look like 2,000 years ago compared to today. So what regions can we see where there's been strong natural selection, where things are a much higher frequency now than they were 2,000 years ago? And the 3 regions and genes that popped out were lactase, which is an enzyme used for milk digestion. So in agriculture, humans drink a lot more milk now than did historically. So there's been strong selection for the enzyme that allows us to digest milk. MHC, major histopathicability complex. So this is a region very important in disease resistance. So when we look at which people have survived malaria or other epidemics, very often MHC is a region of the genome which is under strong selection. And finally, the genes associated with blonde hair and blue eyes. And those are thought to be because of what we call sexual selection. So individuals that had blonder hair and blue eyes were seen by some as being more desirable, and those genes have increased in frequency. So it's interesting just to see what regions have been important, and I have another slide I'll look at later. So remember, it was milk, disease, and sex, sort of 3 regions that were found by looking at the genome. So one of the big points is recognizing that we are not, the idea that we are somehow separate is really a delusion. So we're sitting here in this room, we're breathing oxygen, and oxygen was produced by plants. Tonight we had something for supper, and we were eating other plants or animals. And so we really are completely dependent on the universe around us. And so this is one of the famous quotes from Einstein, that this idea that we are separated from the rest is a kind of an optical delusion. And trying to take this one step further from an evolutionary perspective, just to see how deluded we really are, recognizing that the way that we view the world, we don't view the world objectively. We view the world through our senses, and those senses have evolved by evolution. So it's those characteristics of the environment that were important for our survival and reproduction, which were under stronger natural selection. And there's a famous quote by Theodosius Dobzhansky, a Russian geneticist, who said nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And my favorite example of this is, why do human feces smell like shit? So there's nothing intrinsic about feces that they should smell bad. I mean, we all know that some animals like to eat human shit, dogs, some others, so it must taste good to them. So why from our senses does feces smell so bad? Any ideas? Yes. So we want to say that again? Yeah. So there's a lot of diseases passed on in the feces. So you can imagine little kids sitting around a place in a cave or some other place where humans were living. Those little kids that ate the human shit were much more likely to die, to eat the shit and not survive. So there's been strong selection for humans to avoid eating shit, and the best way to do that is to make it smell like something you'd never want to eat. So this is, from my view, an example of why we can't understand things without evolution, as Dobzhansky said. And all of our interpretation of the world around us is due to this. Not only smell, so things like fear of heights. There's a good reason why a lot of people are afraid of heights. Fear of snakes. For my daughter, I should add fear of spiders, but I don't think I have that here. No, I do have fear of, that's for my daughter. And sex. Now, obviously, sex is really important when it comes to evolution, because if you don't have sex, you don't reproduce, you're not passing on your genes. And the only reason I mention this is because this is so powerful, this urge for sex is so powerful. So the Buddha was known for teaching the middle way. So when it came to things like eating, starving yourself is not a good thing. Eating too much, being a glutton, is also not a good thing. But we should be somewhere in between. So most of the sensual pleasures, the Buddha came down on the side of the middle way, except for sex. And I think this is because sex was such a powerful urge for people that, I mean, I don't know, I didn't talk to the Buddha, but it seems like it must have been so difficult that there was no way to allow people, for the monks and nuns at that point, to have some sex. And so the rule was that they had to be, that sex was not allowed. And so that's the one thing that I'm aware of that the Buddha did not follow the idea of the middle way. And I think that's, again, because it's such a strong evolutionary urge. So I think another way of saying this is nothing makes sense except in light of evolution. And this is a really depressing slide. In November 2016, I realized that, the election results were not that much of a surprise. So this was a study done in 2006, looking at developed countries around the world and the number of people that accepted the view that human beings, as we know them, developed from earlier species of animals. And the US was 33rd out of 34. Turkey is the only country below the US on this scale. So as an evolutionary biologist, I think we failed in terms of educating people. And as I said before, the Dalai Lama has really been a proponent of Buddhism and science, and this is one of his most powerful statements, that if science proves some belief wrong, then Buddhism will have to change. So this, again, is the idea, as the Buddha said, the empirical, understanding the world in an empirical way, testing things, and if some teaching of Buddhism does not meet the scientific test, then Buddhism will have to change. However, on the other hand, Dalai Lama also said this quote, so the idea that mutations being random events, so we believe geneticists, we have these random changes in our genome, some of those are advantageous, some are not. Those that are advantageous in terms of increasing survival or reproduction, increase in frequency. But the Dalai Lama and a number of other Buddhists have said that it's deeply unsatisfying for a theory that purports to explain the origin of life that we have these random mutations which are so essential to evolution. And one of the reasons is because of the idea of karma, that karma or cause and effect is central to the teachings of the Buddha. And some Buddhist scholars, including the Dalai Lama, have argued that the idea of random mutations being by chance cannot account for evolution. So there is part of evolution that even the Dalai Lama and other Buddhists have had trouble accepting. I mean, from my own perspective, I think this is both a lack of understanding of what the Buddha taught and what Darwin taught as well. I really don't think there's any conflict between mutations being random and Buddhism. So chance is an essential part of evolution. So mutations are random. Another thing is genetic drift. So genetic drift is just that, especially in small populations, allele frequencies change just by chance. Some individuals are just by chance more, it's not necessarily that they are more genetically superior, but they just happen to have more children. And this, I think, goes back to the Bible, that the race is not always to the swift. You could say the race is not always to the fit, nor the battle to the strong, for time and chance happen to us all. So randomness is important for evolution, whether we're talking about mutation or genetic drift, and I don't think there's any conflict between that and the idea of karma or cause and effect. So a little bit thinking about human nature. So this is a cartoon I found a while ago that, it's sort of a classic, progression of the way evolution goes from some fish climbing out of the water to amphibians, the reptiles, the mammals, the humans. And what I really like about this is eat, survive, and reproduce, is milk digestion, disease resistance, and sex. So these are the things which are really important for evolution and have been over time. And here tonight we're trying to figure out that final cloud over there on the right. So again, going back to Darwin's idea of we're trapped in this delusion. So this is kind of a prison for our consciousness, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task is to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature and its beauty. And again, going back to the Dalai Lama has said that he thinks that evolution really hasn't dealt with the question of altruism, and he considers it to be the most important drawback of Darwinian evolutionary theory. But again, I think there's some misunderstanding of the Dalai Lama of evolutionary theory. And so if we take a look at natural selection, Charles Darwin, that sort of the basics. So when I taught evolution for 35 years at the University of Montana, if by the end of the course, students understood natural selection, I was happy, because people watch all these nature shows and get the wrong idea about natural selection, that somehow it's about increasing, it's good for whatever's good for the species. From Darwin's perspective, natural selection, there's variation. So look around this room, there's differences in body shape and eye color, hair color. So there's lots of differences. Those differences can affect survival and our reproductive success. And that's what Darwin called fitness. So how many children you leave determines the frequency of your genes in future generations. And if those differences are inherited, they have a genetic basis, then those characteristics like milk digestion, MHC, disease resistance, and blonde hair and blue eyes will increase in frequency. So those genes associated with greater survival or reproductive success will increase in frequency. So that's all we mean by natural selection. However, so how do we explain altruism by the model of natural selection? Because we would think that within populations, genes that are associated with selfish or aggressive behavior may have some advantage that may increase your ability to survive. They may increase the number of children that you have if you're more aggressive. So we might expect that genes, aggressive genes, would increase in frequency within populations. However, there's also genetic differences between groups of individuals. And this is controversial and has been controversial for a number of reasons within evolutionary biology. But at some level, so if we have groups, and we call those tribes and humans, so there are genetic differences between tribes and groups. And rather than survival, if we think about extinction or spread rates, so which of those groups actually increase in frequency and which ones decrease in frequency. And the difference between groups have at least a partial genetic basis, so some of those differences between groups have a genetic basis. Then those characteristics of tribes associated with lower extinction rates or greater rate of survival will increase in frequency. And so there are probably a lot of altruistic behaviors which may reduce the fitness of individuals, but increase the probability of the group spreading and surviving. And so by group, you can explain, and there's other mechanisms as well, but simplistically, we can explain altruism by selection operating on different groups. So just to remind you, the three things I said I'm going to talk about is perception, how our view of the world, whether it comes to sex or feces, is affected by evolution, the importance of understanding the role of chance in evolution, and finally understanding that both are in human nature, both our selfish and altruistic behavior can be explained as products of natural selection operating on different levels. And so I'm happy to answer any questions that people have. Thanks.
Great talk.
Thank you.
You know, the notion of altruism, connection to nature, there's been a lot of great scholars throughout history describing this. I'm wondering, in your journey, why didn't you take up with St. Francis of Assisi or Alva Leopold's concept? What drew you to Zen Buddhism over other animistic or altruistic perspectives of a place within nature?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I just know that, so when I saw the Buddha in Vietnam, something captured me, and I don't know why. And I know when I went to school at Penn State as an undergraduate in chemical engineering, and I took an anthropology course, and they started talking about genetics. And I remember going home that night thinking, I want to work on genetics for the rest of my life. And I mean, I'm so lucky that I felt that way. So I don't know. I can't explain that, but I've just always felt that those. Maybe. Well, I know, but you know, I don't know. I don't know, but that from my experience, I just know from my experience that that's how I felt. And I've been studying genetics ever since, and I still love it. Well, there's one of these two people in this line.
That nature has an intelligence and that some of evolutionary processes were actually part of nature's intelligence?
I do not believe that, no. And somebody way back there?
I'm glad to hear somebody who's been in academia so extensively as you have, making the same conclusions, the same ideas that I have in my independent studies. I'm glad to see that. One of the questions that I'm thinking of, that I've been pondering for a while, is kind of a narrow focus, but the idea that I'm wondering just how concerned we should be on cultural selection for reproduction. The dominant culture, how concerned should we be that the dominant culture seems to be so focused on an anti-intellectual focus, and how how concerned should we be that that's the kind of people that seem to be reproducing the most, or people who have a strong anti-intellectual bent?
Well, two-part answer to that. I think it's extremely harmful to us as a society, but genetically you don't have to worry about it. I think genetically it's too recent and it's not that strong and it's not going to go on long enough to make a difference. So back in the 20s and 30s, a lot of English geneticists were worried about that, and that's where eugenics came from. And I think for those kinds of differences to have an effect, they have to go on for a long period of time. So I think it's terrible culturally for our society, but genetically you don't have to worry about it, from my view.
So seeing as human beings are superior to everything else on the planet, as we know, how do you feel about this species survival plan where there is an endangered species and we go all out to save it at any cost?
So I would guess the first part was facetious.
Yes.
But when I was when I was a grad student, undergrad at Penn State, C.R. Carpenter, who was the first primatologist that went out and studied primates in the field. And I was also drawn to him for some reason. And I still remember, the thing that I remember most from his classes was, these are non-human primates, not subhuman primates. So now I forgot the second part of what you asked.
So what do you think about our efforts to save, the white rhinos and the...
So if you have something that, how many resources do you invest in one species? And I guess the first thing is that Michael Soule, who was sort of the father of conservation biology, I heard him say many times, there are no hopeless cases, but there are many expensive cases. So most of those probably aren't expensive or aren't hopeless, but how much resources should we put into them? And I guess my view, obviously there's no answer to that question, but my view is that we're not trying to preserve, since we're sitting in a zoo, I think we're not trying to preserve species or gene sequences that are in a zoo. I think we're trying to preserve natural ecosystems. So I think that's where effort should be. So some of these ideas of genetic engineering and bringing back mammoths, I really think that's not a very useful thing to do for us as conservation biologists. So I guess even though I'm a geneticist, I lean towards what we're trying to do is preserve ecosystems and not individual species. But practically a conservation biologist, so in the Rocky Mountains, there are NGOs put a lot of effort into bull trout and grizzly bears, I think for two reasons. One is that if we preserve the habitat for bull trout and grizzly bears, a lot of other species are going to benefit as well because they take such large chunks of habitat. And the other is, I guess it's easier to get people excited about grizzly bears than toads. So I tell the story all the time. My wife and I were in Glacier one time, and I got really excited. I was showing her Diane some toads, and she wasn't that excited. And then we went off and we saw some bears, and from then on, every time we bumped into somebody coming down the trail, oh, we saw some bears, but she never told them we saw toads. I think she was embarrassed that her husband was showing her toads. So. We have to use those large charismatic species to get support in conservation, so I think.
There's a book recently by Steven Pinker from Harvard, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and he said over the last 500 years that human progress has been not only positive, but dramatically so, that we're living right now in the least violent time of all human societies. And I wonder if that isn't something that the Dalai Lama could appreciate. If looking for altruism, maybe there's a kind of progress at work in there anyway. I don't know, but it's measurable.
Yeah, and no, I haven't read the book, but I've read about his work. And as a biologist, my response is, how many species have gone extinct in the last 500 years? So it may be better for humans in many ways, But I don't think it's certainly not better for the planet, the biosphere as a whole, in terms of biodiversity in the last 500 years. So again, it depends upon my view, not just my view, that we can't just think about humans, we have to think about our connections with everything else. And if we look at the connections with everything else, the last 500 years have been pretty catastrophic.
Yeah. Well, there is a sixth extinction apparently.
Yeah, yeah. So there's somebody here from New Zealand, and yeah, I spent a lot of time in New Zealand, and Maori got to New Zealand, and within 100 years, almost 200 years, all of the moa were extinct. I mean, 12 species of moa. And so wherever humans have gone around the world, New Zealand is probably the best example, there's been large extinction events. And so things haven't gone well in the last 500 years for biodiversity as a whole, if we think about humans in the larger sense, not in the narrow sense. But I like that question.
It's not related exactly to the topic, but some of us probably won't be there to hear you tomorrow. I just wonder if you could briefly share some of the highlights of what you're doing now in molecular ecology and conservation. Sorry.
I just don't know where to start. And I guess the major thing is that there's so much we can do now with genetics, not just understanding things in a genetic perspective like you do with humans, but just in conservation in general. So for example, for a long time, an example from our part of the world, Glacier National Park. So they wanted to remove grizzly bears from the Endangered Species Act, which I think for the glacier, which is not an unreasonable thing to do, but how many grizzly bears are there in Glacier National Park? Nobody had any idea. So Kate Kendall went out, and she and her hundreds of people put barbed wire on trees throughout Glacier Park, collected hair samples, took them to a genetics lab and analyzed them genetically to estimate how many bears. And so now we know there's about 650 bears in Glacier, but we had no idea before. And there's just so many ways. So I just read a paper on trying to understand biodiversity in the tropics. So there's so many thousands of species in the tropics. So how could it's hard to go out and study all those species. So the way that people are doing it now is collecting leeches, taking the blood meals out of leeches and sequencing the blood and seeing what species the leeches are eating. So you can tell what species are out there just by doing that sequencing. And I could go on and on and on. I'm not going to be talking about any of that tomorrow, but I did write a book about it if you're really interested. At Amazon.com. Is there, go ahead.
What are your thoughts on genetic engineering?
As a conservation tool, I think it's not very useful. And the only case where I think it could be useful is for long-lived plants like trees, which have often have a fairly simple system between one gene and disease resistance. So if there's some rust where there's a particular gene that could bring about disease resistance, I could imagine that maybe putting that gene into the genome of a tree population, a tree species, could be advantageous. But in general, I think it's a waste of money, because I think what we're interested in is not this gene or that gene, but the whole genome. So genetic engineering is aimed at one or two genes. And what we should be thinking about in terms of conservation and genetics is the whole genome, not just one or two, except in that one example, maybe.
Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank Fred for blowing our minds. And I think I can also say this is the first conservation lecture where we've seen quotes from Jane Goodall, Albert Einstein, the Dalai Lama, and Ecclesiastes. They made sense.
Well, that's great. I like that, yeah.
So thank you very much